I wanted to look at this image and really take a few minutes to break the colors down. So I'm going to be using one of the sheets, and I'll be using this side of my sketchbook for a study, and pretty much it's just color swatches of what I would read as the most intense. Let's see if I could use this brush instead. There we are. Most intense, most general colors. What do I mean by that? General colors. Well, we have a tree. You could see there's a tree on the top right side, but there's breakdowns of light, mid-tone, and shadow colors of those greens. So I want to get the general color. Again, this is going to be tons of squinting and getting sort of a shortcut to the colors that I will be using. So it's basically a practice, and we want to do this just quick enough so we have plenty of time to layer and allow one of the things we're going to be working on a lot today, which is managing those edges and layers in our painting. So I'm going to start with lemon yellow. And what I can do here is simply this. I'm going to start with almost in the general area. I want to just touch that lemon yellow and see it at its purest and just color swatch that. And remember, when these begin to dry, you can actually see how light it is. It almost disappears into the page. And we generally do this. We mix yellow and blue, but which yellow, with what blue? So I'm going to touch this lemon yellow, and I'm going to start with a really light mixture of lemon yellow, and I'm going to touch cobalt blue. Just touch it in. And you can begin to do sort of a graph, a cataloging of, make it just a little bit. I'm going to touch just for the record a bit of cobalt blue, and then I'm going to add just a little more pigment to it to see a difference in the saturation. So once you're running with your paint, and I mean as we start considering composition, moisture, technique, we're going to try to take care of one thing less, which is probably the most important thing here. What are the general colors that I'm going to want to explore? So we don't run the risk of losing track. And this is the kind of rehearsal you would want for this. So I'm actually going to switch brushes. I need this to be smaller. I don't need these swatches to be so big. So I'm going to go back into lemon yellow. And the way I could set this up is so many different ways. A little bit of lemon yellow, and this time I'm going to go with ultramarine blue. So just touching a bit of ultramarine blue, just to keep track of what I'm looking for. And I'm going to go heavy with lemon yellow pigment, a Hansa yellow, cobalt yellow, all of these would work. And then just touch it with a bit of ultramarine blue. And immediately I could see that this is a beautiful variation of green for those shadows, a lot closer. Now, this is just plain primary pigment. Remember, we get to neutralize these. We get to add maybe a touch of red. Now, that would be another thing to explore. Should I use cool red, warm red? Let's do it now. So I'm going to split this mixture into two. Try to do that. And one of them I'm going to touch with cool red. So I'll do a dot of cool red here and mix that. And love how this immediately gives me this greenish gray, which I also recognize and see coming up in the painting. Now, I would have probably done this intuitively, but it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to actually test it out and maybe come up with a new idea. Now, I added a bit of cadmium red, warm red, and now I'm getting this greenish brown, neutral gray, which I also see some areas of the tree trunk. Let's touch it with just a bit of cadmium red. And why not? Let's go ahead and, if you have some greens, begin to push and stretch those. So here I have some Pearland green. And this is already a neutral type of green. And what would happen if I push that with a little bit of cobalt blue? So I hope you understand what we're trying to do here. We're trying to generate an understanding. Let's add a little more cobalt blue. Really make that visible. So I could swatch that as well. Make sure I tap it with a little bit of cobalt blue. So the idea here is, okay, Pearland green, cobalt blue gives me this. Pearland green, and I'm going to go to ultramarine blue. So I'm basically playing with temperature shifts here. And let's go ahead and swatch this here. Yeah, it's a beautiful shadow color here. And how blue or how green? Well, that's also part of the mixing that you want to do. And maybe even play with values as well. Like, see how far I could push some of these into different value ranges. I'm going to try one more. This is my olive green. And with this olive green, let's go ahead and touch it with. And I could go in several different directions here. So olive green, I could see it going, let's swatch just pure olive green here. Made that very dense, very saturated. Let's lift a little bit, just so you could see it better. See the difference in temperature? And olive green, we could go towards yellow. So let me add lemon yellow and also yellow ochre. See what happens with these variations. Intuitively, we would have a sense if we've done this before. Well, it's going to get brighter, obviously. And ooh, do I like this one better than this one? Absolutely. So I found my lightest general color for the tree here. This is it. Olive green with lemon yellow. That's going to give me that brightness, that yellow green that I'm looking for. Well, since we have this still right there sitting, let's go ahead and add a little bit of yellow ochre. And also a nice earthy neutral light value variation to it. Here it is. But even further than that, I take this olive green now. And I'm going to push it towards the cobalt. So this is cobalt blue. Also love it. And here's where you begin to maybe find answers. Well, that's what Sargent did. He really didn't mix all of the greens through blues and yellows. He may have used some Viridian green, Pearland green, olive green in this case is what I see, and then push them with extra yellow or extra blue. Let's go ahead and tap that with cobalt. And this one will be ultramarine. And we bring more olive green. My palette is running out of room here, so I'm going to have to do a quick cleanup. Save some of those. You're going to want to try to save some of those that are looking great. But you have the record here. Oh, and this is also really interesting. Olive green, ultramarine blue. Look at that. And I also see this happening. So there's some answers. Look at these neutral grays as they begin to dry. So using, see, I would have forgotten. How did I get here? Well, we did that with lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, we got this green. And to this green, we added cool red and warm red, just a touch, to get these beautiful neutrals. Now that they're drying, I see all the possibilities for me to use that color mixture on most of these walls, under the tree, the shadow areas, these neutral colors. So since we're still here, let's go ahead and play just a little more with olive green. And we have several of these mixes. So I'm gonna play with olive green. Let me do a big swatch here of olive green. And then I'm going to add a touch of cool red and a touch of warm red. So I have a quinacridone rose, and I also have, or a magenta, and a cadmium red. So let's go ahead and bring cool red is going to give me immediately a very deep, warm brown green. Not at all close to this one. Actually, it does give me more tree trunk, and you see there's an area of the tree trunk that mixes with that light. We also have a second tree back here in this area where it's almost like an autumn tree, begins to go towards orange. That could be it right here. And the reason I did it on this page here is because I'm going to have it right next to the page in my sketchbook where I will be working those colors. So I could just look over to the side and have that answer. A little more olive green. And this one, ooh, really, really interesting. It has the green, but it yells brown, but it's really warm brown where you almost want to see, you're seeing orange. And again, giving this a few minutes to dry, you are going to have a good scheme. Since we have a little more room, you could do this with more colors. We've played, this is just to answer what stands out the most to me, which is those bright yellow greens and the shadows and the neutrals of that area of the tree. Obviously, we push just a little more from the green into the blue, and we'll have some of those blues, but it also plays with those violets. So I'm going to use a little bit of this area here, and I could almost see that already answered. I'm going to go ahead and wipe down my palette just a little bit. Make some room for new mixtures. So this is a good exercise. Just, I don't have to worry about tree trunks and composition and leaves and techniques and brush strokes. Nope, I just want to see colors and how I get more out of them without the stress while we're painting, becoming a better colorist. And that's one of the things Sargent, as a master, really brings in every one of his works. So we know cobalt blue. I'm going to go ahead and tap it here, cobalt blue. And my cool red are going to give me this. Let's add a little more cobalt blue to it. Variation of violets. From a little more red violet to maybe even a little more blue violet. And you could do this as a spectrum where it goes all the way from blue to all the way red. And read how those violets, and kind of recognize where I'm going to need them. but also the value of them, the saturation that I want to use. Today is going to be very light, very airy, like a lot of air. There's sense of space through the lightness of the value of these color mixes. Let's go ahead and try ultramarine blue. We're going to place that right here with that same quinacridone rose. So cool red. And the reason I'm seeing this, there's coolness in these violets that contrast some of the green. So the red, the coolness in that red starts here. And it begins to get more violet and more blue. Obviously you see it's deeper, and the temperature, you may see some of it here and there, but it doesn't seem to me like the one we're gonna need today. And I didn't even test the warm reds. I'm sure they're there, but I know right through here, these greens and reds and these green neutral reds variations, that I'm going to find those shadow colors. Some of those greens that get a little mintier, that's going to be through cool blues. And then with that, I think I'm ready to start my painting. So I'm going to move this just over here. And as I continue working on this Sargent sketchbook, I'm going to stay consistent, and I'm going to add just a bit of just the masking tape. For a nice frame. Going all the way around. Just gives your sketchbook a bit of consistency, the look of it. And I also think you work a little less stressed about edges, knowing that it goes off the frame, on the tape, and then that very satisfying moment at the end when you peel it off and it looks just a little bit more planned, more professional. In a way. Just making sure it sticks all the way. And I guess that is a lucky, interesting choice of color for the tape, which also, being pink, working off that green, could maybe affect the way I see colors there. So, a sketch like this, you would want to attack it straight away with the lightest wash that you can actually see as a general color, and then build up slowly. So two things that I really want to focus on today: my color selection and the edges of those techniques. So when I apply a color, the edge of those colors, there's some sharp edges, obviously, you could see the brush strokes, but most of them are almost bleeding into the other, creating that sense of space. And that is what I see. But as always, you can add some pencil lines for a bit of drawing here. So either way, whether you do some lines, and I'm going to keep these ultra light, so you may not see them as clear on video here. Just what am I focusing on? What am I trying to achieve? General sense of composition. One of the biggest lines, and you'll see that, is right here. This perspective line that goes the side of this wall at the bottom, and that angle also at the top of that wall with then this tree behind it. All the other lines should, for example, we have this element of the corner here with extreme perspective. So that angle with the brush stroke could be something that you can also play off of. And you have that nice cool blue. And this is not through drawing. It's going to be, it almost seems like a vertical line. So we're going to have to deal with that brush and creating that edge. As I always recommend, you need to be there. You need to place yourself in that street, on that street, and feel the air, feel the sunlight, get a feeling for those shadows. But at the same time, deconstruct it into the simplest. And what they are, shapes of color at a certain value. There we are. So I'm going across somewhat of a horizon line here above the top of those buildings. Some of these elements mapping out a little bit of light. And then we have our perspective here. So coming across, knowing where the center of my image is and matching that with what I need to see, where I need to see. And it's the bottom of this. It's the bottom of this tree branch here. How you would decide to use negative space if you do. And how to make some of these a little more extreme if needed. And I'm talking about the angles. So one of the most important areas here is this ground, the light and the shadows on this ground, plus the light and the play of the perspective on this wall are going to create that look, that why we would choose this as a scene, I believe. It's not so much the tree's just there, and it creates obviously tons of other visual elements, breaks and gaps, a lot of negative space. Meaning some of those openings between some of those brush strokes. But overall, it's just there, and I'll just begin to layer and construct. Coming all the way to the other side. Some of these you will see purely as negative space. Doing a little bit of blank drawing here. Trying to make sure I see all of these elements coming together, beginning to create a few relationships. So I can do these arches. I'm just adding the verticals right now, just to get a sense of size, and then matching the perspective. Another interesting color that we see happening here with these reddish earth tones. And I think we've been there before, knowing Sargent now after a few weeks. These violets, the blues, and some of those red earth tones should not be a problem at all. Just making some marks for some of the elements back here where I need to preserve some light. And then this tree, very small. So working a little bit larger here would be a great A little bit larger, maybe even than what I'm working here. Make it easier. Otherwise, you're going to have to work with a very small brush. There we are. So you could see a ghost of my drawing there. And where would I start? Now there's going to be lots of drying time. I'm going to want to use, maybe today's a good day to use a hair dryer. I have a heat gun to really maximize the time between these layers. Let me go ahead and I'm going to start with, as I squint, I look for light. Lightest of the light here. And according to my reference, I'm going to create just an edge of, oop, that's a lot of pigment there. Too much. Lift that. I am going to just create, which in the end may just disappear, but it at least will vanish some of that white of the page. Starting with just a touch. On some of these lines, some of this background. Through squinting. And just adding that touch of warm, that somehow it's going to hold all of that cool green blue together. And want to make sure I see it everywhere, which again, squinting, you begin to see a lot of it because it may pollute. As you look at for one color, it starts to appear in almost a sense of it in every other color. There we are. So just as a first very, very light wash of what I would consider is going to remain as the light. Some of this wall. We could add just a little more here. And I'm going to actually touch that with a tiny bit of some of the leftover color that I was using, which maybe begins to be a little of this wet on wet. So using a lot of wet on dry for starters. And here, just a little bit of wet on wet with first touches of this cool green popping up on this warm side. All of this as part of our first wash. And it should be loose. This is something you could work over as it dries. And it's so light, it'll actually act as a really interesting layer later on. Just grabbing my heat gun really quick. But other than that, usually I use my bigger brush. It's Japanese, fine tip. Today it may be too big, so I'm going to use this quill. It does give me that a little bit of fine point, but it's more the moisture, the way I can handle heavier moisture. So I'm going to go with the second very ultralight layer of a little bit of cobalt blue or cerulean blue. And again, remember, this is for inspiration. So taking some inspiration from Sargent, you get to play with these colors a little bit more. So I'm using a little bit of cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultralight, and hinting just at that bit of sky back there. Maybe adding a little bit of gradient. And why not? I'm going right into the area of what will be greens. So basically I'm doing biggest, simplest, and lightest first. If I do work some lines in here, I don't want to lose them. I want to make sure I see the lines I need for now. But already I begin to see them working together. And most of these they stay almost primary, clean, yellow ochre, touched it with a tiny bit of green, olive green, and this cobalt blue and a touch of cerulean blue. Also very, as a pigment, very clean as a layer. Some of this cerulean blue, I'm going to use it because it's so light. And it'll work as a layer. I'm going to start bringing a little bit of it into some of the shadow area. Although it will be violet, there's a way to make these come together. Some of them you may see as a one stroke and one color, not as a layer. But you see how they begin to blend in. And you do want to pay a lot of attention. This right here could be the make or break of this piece. How you deal with these shadows on the ground here. Bring some of that all the way through. And just a little cooler right on this side. Now, as you strategize for these, you may see there's a little bit of gravity here. So you'll see me lift and drip when we get to this area. But for the most part, just letting the color sit, soak in, as I continue mixing. So with these blues, I'm going to start bringing in just a little bit of those violets. And I'm going to start a little bluer, especially here on this area. And I begin to play with brush stroke as well. So some of that texture that really just comes from, and this area is still too wet for this violet, but we could use some of that wet on wet. And a little bit of bleeding of these colors to create that airiness that I was talking about earlier. Continue squinting and beginning to use technique such as wet on wet. And this is a very basic standard color here, that very light violet where you see soft edges. And you have to be very patient. You don't want to overwork this. Hopefully I do recommend having a tissue paper, Kleenex, or a brush for lifting, because you want to pull out at some point some of that light. So Kleenex and tissue paper sometimes is best when you just want to barely dab it and maintain that sense of light in the air. So where we spend a little more time, and you're seeing a little bit of saturation now as I added a touch of blue to let this right here, wet on wet, begin to take shape. And you want to not forget about other areas. Continue squinting and really take advantage of some of these levels of moisture. But let them bleed into the opposite color, or the color that's set. And I'm almost going, my eye is just dancing all the way around this image right now, looking for those patterns of color. And as I said earlier, you need to be there. You need to sense, feel all of the things that you're trying to capture here. I'm going to go for ultramarine blue, just a first touch of ultramarine blue right here. There's a little pop of that color there. Also bringing a little bit of moisture into wet areas, creating some of that technique, that wet on wet technique, pushing the pigment. There's a little bit of a break of light right in here. So I'm really doing my best to manage not just the temperature of this violet, but also the mechanics of that wet on wet technique. So I don't want to overdo it. And I think I need to start bringing it in here. As my sky begins to dry, I'm going to bring just a bit of this shadow on this side of the wall. There we go. And you begin to really read space a little bit better. One brushstroke at a time. Areas where I see a little bit of red or violet, so I'm adding a little more cool red. A little more water, bring down that value. And then lifting just a little bit. So I touch my brush to the paper towel, just enough to get a sense of control over that level of moisture. And then drag, push some of that pigment carefully. And also beginning to manage the edge of some of these shadows. So as it's reaching that perfect moment of moisture, I want to make sure I control the edge with nothing but a tiny bit of clean water. And without dragging, but more redirecting. It's a bit more of redirecting, really. There's some granulation going on that I'm loving as well. Unintentional, just it's the pigments doing what they do best. And you notice my strokes and my brush strokes getting a little bit more controlled. And I think I'm avoiding just a little. And I want to make sure I get all of this, what I see as backgrounds. Lighter areas of color, of background, mostly complete before I get into the greens. So far we're managing that. Let's bring a little bit more of this and start looking at a few neutralizing colors for some of these areas of violet shadows here. So how would I make a violet neutral? Well, I go into the yellows. So I'm going to go into the yellow ochre for some of these variations. And it may be too much because I still want to see some green. So it's going to be more of a blue violet. Let's see if that works. So a lot more blue. A touch of cool red. Having that somewhat that feel of violet, but more blue violet. And then just a bit of yellow ochre. And yep, there's that grayish. Now between that gray and what I would hope to see more of a gray-green, that's going to be the trick. Because with reds and greens, making sure you have the right neutral temperature is what I'm looking for a little bit closer. And I think I got it. We tested some on this side of the page, and you can always, again, bring it right over. And that's the value that I want, and that's going to go right over here on this wall. A little bit of looseness. Some right over here on this edge. I could actually even bring it over here, even though it will get warmer. I see some of that color popping up on the background there. And here at some of these bottom areas. Really at the touch of that base. Even a little bit here in this doorway. So, once again, scanning around, looking for those shifts, and all around this corner. I'm going to have to revisit that color with a little more saturation. And now I think it's time for me to, while I still wait for some of this to dry a little bit better, the edges were a little too wet on wet. But I can always come back and sharpen some of these edges, take advantage of some of this. Most importantly is preserving that light. And this was very wet, so I tried my best to get the most out of that effect. There's one little area here as well. And let's go ahead and bring this, or begin to bring this into, where should I start first? What do you think? Well, we had those color swatches we did earlier, and I remember seeing it clearly, which is lemon yellow, olive green, and that's going to be my lightest and brightest. Starting all the way over here. So making sure every area that you need dry is dry. And obviously you could work those smaller areas of darker shadows. So this you can actually just, once you get into here, except for those breaks of light that you absolutely want, you want to make sure you break those brush strokes. I highly recommend blind painting here, almost like drawing. But you absolutely want to make sure you follow the shape. Maintain that negative space, which is really rich for this image. And don't forget Don't lose your sense of place. Really, really take a close look at coming over from this side now at these shapes of color. Don't forget about looseness. I'm pushing some of this a little yellower, and I'm going to want to also push it a little greener, but all of them with light value. And look how nice, how beautiful. Some of the sky and that blue, whether it's layered or blended, it reads really, really nice. And I think it's beginning to show up. It's beginning to come through. I'm going to work some of this same color right down in here. Neutralized it just a little bit. As you would read it in the shadows here, in the light, in the reflected light. Need to mix a little more. But a little more yellow this time. And some of these I will actually have to wait until it's fully dry. Do I see a little bit of green back here? We could use just a hint. It will neutralize what eventually will be more of a orange, reddish brown. I kind of missed just a little bit this area where it all becomes blurred. I was being a little too cautious, careful, and it needed to be just a little smaller. There's a tiny little edge. I'm adding a little bit of saturation with a little bit of a deeper violet. I'm looking for a purple, actually, like a middle of the road in terms of cool blue, cool red there. And then soften that edge. There we are. While that is still wet, I want to bring some of it right in here and begin to let them bleed and neutralize this area as well. So making sure this green and the violet that I've been mixing all along at the right time creates that shadow effect through neutralizing those colors. And it may look off, but remember, you have to let the colors do. You have to trust what you know is going to work out. And it's already beginning to show up. A little more violet, need more violet in here. Bring just a little more of this violet down this area. So the shapes are getting smaller and just a little bit more complex. We get to play a little more with edges and the beautiful techniques that we can do there. olive green, and in this case cadmium red, which gives us that temperature shift. Now I'm hesitant here because we still have a little wetness, and I don't want that to really bleed too much into the colors that I just set there. But we begin to add a little bit of that neutralizer right in these areas. This is going to be a lot grayer, so let's lift that up a little bit. And you can also begin to see it here as well, popping up under. Although we see a little bit of deeper green there too. I'm beginning to scumble with my brush, creating a little bit of texture. You know, tree trunk kind of technique, texture. A few strokes of that color here and there. So now as I'm at the point where I'm beginning to really start getting that sense of color. I'm sorry, the sense of space through color. So all the values are reading somewhat, I would say, correct in that neighborhood that we talked about. It's going to be about clarity with brushstroke now. What we do with those, with the arrangement of those colors, and some of the effects that we choose to put in here. Neutralizing this side of the building, and I don't know if you could see it, that light gray, but it also gives us this warm. So I want that to be ultra light and come through just a little bit. There it is. Starting to use a little more cadmium red in some of these mixes to get that very neutral gray we were doing early on from the swatches that I saw. And you see that a little bit more saturation. So here I'm going to need to manage how this green becomes more blue in some of these areas. So I'm going to do it step by step. No rush. You can actually spend quite a bit of time here to make sure this, which is almost a focal point, the lines point this way, but here lots of colors and the light shadow kind of clash. Although yes, of course it's everywhere else. You do see how it stands out. It's also bigger, a bigger area, bigger surface area. So that also counts as having to pay a little more attention to it. And those color gradients, how it goes from green towards a little more blue, and then the neutrality of those blues. So I'm working off of that mixture, beginning to bring it into these tree trunk areas. A little more green, a little more blue. Letting it bleed into some of that color that's already there. But don't want to overdo that. Using what's already working there. And then also making sure I preserve some of that light or that layering, the translucency of the colors we spent so much time. Oh, that's perfect. That's beautiful. And that's it. It's about timing your technique with the wet on wet and patience. So the only thing you want to be careful, really want to be careful with, is making sure you're using the right brush. Number one, I'm going to switch to a finer tip as I'm bringing a little bit of ultramarine blue here. And there's just a touch of ultramarine, giving that edge and a little bit of volume to that part of the tree. And also some of these touches of gaps with deeper blue in the sky. But not too deep. Using that cobalt cerulean blue we had earlier, just want to sharpen the shape of it basically. Starting to create more of that sky through the branches feel. Squinting almost all the way through as you consider a new area. You want to see the shape, you want to see the value, you want to see the general color of it. Make sure you squint, read, and make sure you're seeing and understanding, yep, that's what I need to do there. Try not to guess. Avoid guessing. Pause if you need to and understand if what you're thinking in terms of color, any of those decisions is going to hurt what you already have there. Sometimes you have little happy accidents like that one there. It just bleeds out, but I like it. Leave it alone. I'm going to begin to neutralize a little more of this cadmium red. I'm going to bring in a little bit of perlin green. And we had that over here on this side as well. That perlin green with the blues also worked really nice. And I'm going to use sharp edges here, neutralized, as it begins to get warmer. But we also have some tree, like shadows of tree branches there. Just not super specific, but they're there. So I'm kind of drawing that in. And the value, I don't want it to really compete with what we were trying to build there, that blurriness that I spoke of earlier. So this is fully dry. You want to make sure it's fully dry. So if anything, it just layers over. And here at the top, what I really want to do is make sure it becomes warmer. Also, there's a bit of violet in there, so I didn't layer any violet. Let's go ahead and grab some violet, touch it in there. Ooh, that's very neutral. And then really warm up this color. So this should have been done first and then layered over. What I just did Should have been backwards. Lightest color first, and then layer over it so we could see those variations. I was already getting caught up in this area, so see if I could still work that backwards. There we go. And it's somewhat, once it dries a little more, I'm pretty sure it will be just fine. As areas begin to dry, I'm going to rework, and I'm going to save this for pretty much that final. You could see how it's just simple from what used to be deep violets, purples, red or blue violets, towards more blue, almost turquoise, that combination blue-green here. And it's obviously like a grayish, neutral turquoise. So I'm going to save that and the shape of some of these. Oops, did a little. Of these very, very important shadows down here last. Because I think that's almost how that worked out. Going back into some of these greens, and I just touched a tiny bit of burnt umber here because I want this and test this contrasting what is a lighter version towards what I see in this side of the building here with a little redder. And then let that drip just a little bit. There we go. Let it settle back in. We have lots of little elements that are going to need just a little bit of rework. Finer brush stroke with very, very specific, meaning some of these edges down here of architectural features where there's breaks in value and in light. Remember, just keep it loose. Do not stop looking at your reference and capturing the information through a nice quick analysis of what is the value, what is the shape. Make it abstract. What's the proper technique? Adding just a little more red to this violet. Really beginning to see how I can manage shifting lights, but enough variation to some of these values and strokes. Already it looks interesting without me having to do more than that. Is it precise? Is that what that little window or touch of the building and the edge or the frame of a window, is that what they look like? Well, it doesn't really, it's not what this is about. Suggesting it and being able to capture that simply saying it as simple as possible creates more character, more intrigue when it's not fully spelled out. Because now it could be anything else. It could be whatever the viewer wishes to see. It could be something that reminds them of their childhood home, which is not what you were trying to do. And that's the way it works. Us trying to tell everyone what they need to see, and then they, the viewer, choosing to make out what they choose, what they actually react to, which is what simply is there. Shapes of color, arranged in a very playful manner. That's usually what works. I'm going to bring just a little more cobalt blue. It seems sort of neutralized just a little bit, but it dulls it to a point where I'm almost wanting to go low value, just to create that edge, that difference between sky and building. And I know there's a little drop there with perspective. I think that'll do it. As this continues to dry here, I see it working more and more because it also has that granulation effect. But there's some swatches of brushstroke here. Very interesting. Where I'm going to have to almost put, again, some burnt umber in there. Into that blue, blue-violet, and mix. And I know it's more of a drip thing. But right at the edge, neutralized violet with burnt umber here. Create an additional edge, just contrast with soft edge. Coming back with the wet brush. Very, almost not random. Again, I go back to that word, looseness. There is a looseness to how you see it and then how you decide to brush it in. Saturation beginning to get just a little bit heavier. Sharper. There's so much simplicity here that don't really even want to touch it too much. Knowing I will have to come back and work these shadows in, but it's almost working. There's something about it I really like. There we go. So now it's time to go into these deep greens. So I have my color swatches. We had answers here. And I saw the olive green with ultramarine blue. Easy answer. And you do see some speckles of ultramarine blue, almost as if he mixed it on the paper. And then I'll neutralize that with a little bit of cadmium red. That's the one I saw here as well. but not having to mix a green, olive green, which is what we used also for the lightest and brightest, with ultramarine blue, and then a bit of a spectrum, spectrum of it. So I don't want all of them to be exactly that. I'm going to start over here at the edge, where you begin to get a sense of, and again, one touch of brushstroke, trying to create that format of it says leaf, just with that one brushstroke, making sure they're not too obvious in terms of repetitive brushstroke. And here they begin to mix and blend with that layer. Almost doing all of this with just a touch of blind drawing, adding just a bit of water to some of these. Create that wet on wet effect. They get looser, bigger as they get further in, and they also will get more neutral. So I'm going to follow that very carefully. Trying to match those shapes, but also reading the colors that are there, that were there before. Some of the sharpness or blurriness of some of these edges. Well, this is one of my favorite things now, the way that accidentally bled into that wet area, and now it looks amazing. Wish I could do more of it. That's looking for those things. It's crucial. And knowing intentionally how to do it next time, also important for you to begin to get more out of that approach. Beginning to get a little bit, needs to get a little darker pretty soon with some more ultramarine, also a little more saturation. So I just added a little more ultramarine, and you're going to see this shift to a cooler, darker version of that green, and even more ultramarine blue as it gets into this. You could see it's just almost pure blue and some specks of it. Bring some of that up here, just one or two touches. So this is how we're beginning to create that sense of volume, and it falling over the street, covering all of that area, creating these beautiful shadows we will develop in a second. But remember, you're there. You have to be there. It takes a little bit of becoming an actor, taking over that role that as the artist, you have to connect with the subject. What is the subject here? Well, it's this light and these shadows. And for you to really feel like you're there, I've been there. Let me go back there again, using that sense of that power of imagination, plus obviously the reference, information from the reference, to begin to create that sense of, yep, this is very familiar to me, and I can add my own touch to it, my own version of my read. I'm going to bring in just a little more ultramarine for this final touch here. And it just goes right through here. Just deepening that mixture on the tree trunk, coming over down here, down on this wall, just a little bit. There's some really interesting patterns of technique, washed and layered, happening on this strip of the wall. So using a simple approach of layering and with some of that brush stroke, making sure you have the right value, right consistency, right color. We're going to bring that downwards and just a little bit upwards too. You see it from the ground up. So using the side of the brush, almost laid flat, dragging that, creating that shape. Neutralizing some of these colors now. Using the same mixture, but just neutralizing. So what I did, again, I brought some burnt umber, and we're going to deepen this shadow here. And at the bottom. And it's not much that you need to do. It's just a touch of a brush stroke. And wow, for the first time, I looked at the screen and okay, got a smile on my face. When you feel like I've been in the zone for a little while, I was there. Did my best to go there. Really get that sense of light. Using a little bit weighted for some of this wet on wet. Right on the side of this wall. And let that just soften that edge with neutral colors. More neutral colors coming through. A little water. More wet on wet. And then we come to the final touch, which would be making sure you have that right brush. Going back to cobalt blue. One of these just seems like I'm going to touch a bit of ultramarine blue into my cobalt blue. Making sure I have the right value. And bringing some of these edges of shape to the shadow. Right through here. Almost scumbled with the brush. And adding just those hints. So before it dries, while it's wet, I want to be ready to come in and catch it at the perfect time to mix in a more neutral or a more red violet. Let's bring this back here, and this shape is crucial. Just one like this. A little more neutral. Most of it based off of cobalt blue. How do I get that turquoise? We didn't sketch it out. Well, if you have a turquoise, you would want to add green. In this case, you want to make sure you have that cool yellow, cool blue. Actually, you could touch some to the wall over here and neutralize it just a bit for these shadows down here. With a little more water. Make sure you're using that wet on wet and maintaining that looseness. Bringing over some of this violet over here. Dropping in just dabs of it. Not too much. that's it. This is where I absolutely would recommend, for me, pause, doing a little bit of lifting here, just a bit of extra water, softening some of this edge. There's this beautiful effect with the wet on wet that is done from the very beginning, from that very first layer. But you soften that up just a little bit, soften some of these edges, and you begin to get that walled, washed with light, very gently, softening more and more of these edges. You do want that. This looks like stains on the wall with those edges, so you preserve that, but not much of a hard edge. And then capturing that sense of light, getting that feel for what in the beginning was very simple, greens and violets, and touches of warm, very satisfying watercolor experience. I hope you enjoyed it.